Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the SJSU GenEC podcast. My name is Jenny, and I'm the Educational Programmer for the Gender Equity Center. Welcome to our podcast, where we address many gender-based issues through an intersectional lens. Thank you for joining us on this journey as we learn, explore, and discover issues together. I am excited to introduce today's guest collaborators for a conversation on voting, voter suppression, gender and sexual politics, and the importance of the vote. We welcome faculty from several different departments: the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department, the History Department, and the Chicano Studies Department to bring you the discussion.
So I'm Tanya Bahkru. I'm the program coordinator of the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program at San Jose State. And this is a conversation about the 100-year anniversary of the 19th Amendment and getting into some of the nuances around gender and race and sexuality as it pertains to voting and voting rights. And Jack, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Jack Caraves. My pronouns are he, they, and I'm an assistant professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at San Jose State, and I also have my own podcast called Unsell Doing It, and yeah, excited to be here today.
Awesome. Rosanna, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Rosanna Alverez. I'm here crashing the party over from Chicano Studies Department. I teach a few different courses there, and my favorite of all time is the Gender and Sexuality in Chicano communities. And I also have a podcast, the Hala Chingona podcast, which coincidentally was, I kind of felt like just going for it after I saw Jack go for it with Anzal doing it. So thank you for that added oomph.
Awesome.
And Wendy.
Yeah, I'm Wendy Rouse, and I teach history in the Department of History here and social science teacher prep. I do not have a podcast, but now I feel like I should.
Awesome. So I thought one good way to just get the ball rolling or the conversation started is for each of us to share a significant voting memory that we have, like, of our own, whether it might be the first time you voted or a particular election that stood out to you or anything like that. So anybody have like a interesting voting or significant voting memory?
I can start. So this is Jack, but so when I heard the question or read the question, I immediately thought of going to vote with my mom. My mom migrated from Mexico in the late 70s, and she was naturalized through IRCA, and that was passed in 1986. And so she became a citizen sometime in the early 90s. And so I must have been like 6 years old-ish. I can't remember how old I was. But I was pretty young, like elementary school age. And I remember the first year she went to go vote, I went with her, and I actually, as a first gen kid, and my mom, speaking English, but, struggling to figure out like the propositions and like who to vote for and all those things. I went in with her into the like polling place, and she had me read all the like measures that were being passed. I think it was like Bill Clinton who was running for president at that time. Or something like that. But I just remember going to the polling place near our house that was at the elementary school I was going to, and going with her, reading the things, and literally like telling her what to vote for, essentially, right? Because I was not only her interpreter or translator, but also, as a kid, had to kind of just navigate and understanding like the political landscape, right? So that's one of my earliest memories of voting, well under the age that I could actually vote, but it really shaped, right, what I thought about the democratic and political process in terms of like the importance of it and being able to vote and being able to have a voice, right, in that way. So I learned, so it was really important for me early on, seeing my mom do that once she became a citizen, to feel that kind of like responsibility, and then me taking that on. And, you know, once I turned 18, I started voting and was excited to do so, but more so for using it as a responsibility in terms of the community that I come from, and using my vote to speak in that way. So that's my memory.
Awesome, thank you. Rosanna or Wendy, do you want to share a significant voting memory?
Yeah, I'll go. I was trying to figure out, like, again, because I was a kid, so obviously my vote didn't count quite yet. But there was this thing that they were doing, and I don't know if it was specific to San Jose and where I grew up, but it was like this Kids Rock the Vote effort. And so I remember, and I was like, okay, so was it in 88 or 92? And I'm like, it had to have been 88 because there were so many dorky, inappropriate rhymes happening in the neighborhood over that particular election with Bush and Dukakis. And it was just like a thing. And so as weird as that backdrop was happening, there was also this effort of like coloring pages and showing up to this church down the street. And I remember my older cousin walked me over there and I was like, I'm gonna vote. And I knew it didn't count, but they totally went through all the motions of like, here's how you know do the whole thing with the chads, and here's how the voting booth looks, and you got your sticker. And so I was like, you know, if I'm remembering this right, 8 years old, walking out of there like, yes, I voted and I know what voting means. And that was different for me because even though my mom could vote, she didn't feel, anxiety just kicked in full force. And so it was always like leaning on us to figure out, you know, how to navigate all of that. So I remember being like, I know how to vote now, and it's not going to count for another 10 years, but I know how to do it and I'm excited, right? And there's a bunch of kids around the neighborhood all excited to vote with our stickers and are like, what the heck is a hanging chad? Now we know. And so, you know, obviously my vote didn't count until way later, but by then it's like, I think we did that twice because I remember being older and feeling like the dorkiness of remembering how I had gone in the first time, but still being like, well, this is kind of cool. Even though our vote doesn't count, it's interesting to see like what our thoughts are on this issue and to even see what the process is supposed to be like. And so by the time I was able to vote, I was super excited to be like, I am registered, I'm going, this matters, it counts. And, you know, might have had everything to do with why I decided to eventually major in political science. But it was just this very different story of how I felt compelled to participate, and how much of certain barriers that I saw my own mom, who was born in this country, kind of feeling, that were by way of that effort that seemed maybe silly to some other adults at the time, had so much value, you know, all the way into my actual voting years. And so I have voted in every election since then because, again, those voices matter. Yeah, so much so that it overshadows my actual first voting experience. Like I'm thinking right now, I'm like, holy crap, what was my first actual it counts, you know, vote? And I'm like, I don't know, it doesn't matter. That one matters more for some reason because I was already doing the thing and engaged and willing to go over there and get my sticker every time. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Wendy?
Yeah, I just remember, I mean, the same feelings that everyone else is describing, just that sense of excitement that first time that I went to vote. I was always a little history nerd, so I just felt this overwhelming like sense of responsibility, like my vote really matters, my voice really matters, and being excited and probably over reading the voter guide and just trying to make sure I really understood everything, and just feeling like this was my rite of passage into adulthood too, and being a citizen. I really did like feel all of those things. And then the second most significant memory of voting was the 2016 election, which I'm sure everyone has their memories associated with that. But I was a high school history teacher, and every day I would go into my classroom and see that we had pictures of each president wrapped around the room. And I taught at an all-girls high school, and every day we would talk and think about in some different aspect of history and women's history and the women's rights and whatnot. So I thought when we went to cast a ballot in 2016, I thought for the first time there was going to be, right, a woman on that wall. So that was interesting, and the outcome of that, obviously we're all dealing with the repercussions of that. But I think just knowing that this is part of this longer, like, historical struggle for women's rights too has always been in the back of my head. So every time I vote, I think about that.
That's awesome. I'll just share mine really quick. My mom, I love how for many of us, like, our moms feature prominently in our voting experiences. So my mom also, she volunteered to be a precinct worker. And so for me, a lot of my earliest voting memories are like going with her to get all the supplies, like all the boxes of paper ballots, the voting machines, the polling stations that you have to like assemble, and then, her enlisting me as like free labor basically to, like put together the booths. And you're supposed to count all the ballots ahead of time to make sure that each ream of ballot has like the appropriate numbers. I had to sit there and like count all the ballots and test out the voting machines to make sure they worked and all of that. And then, on voting day, it's like you have to get up really early. A lot of the precincts open at like 6 a.m. So it's like get up at 5. You have to get there, make sure everything's in order, and then they're open till very late, and then you have to stay after and clean up. So voting day was a really big deal in my household because it was all about like mobilizing all the free labor of the kids to help my mom to like set up the polling station, and then bring her lunch and bring her dinner so that she could keep working. And so I think for me, just from like the earliest of ages, it was just really driven home to me that voting is really important because it's a civic duty. And if you can vote, that it's really important to do that. And, my dad was also, became a naturalized citizen, and kind of hearing the story of like everything that he had to go through and the ceremony that he had to go through. And there was something very meaningful in that. So just, kind of taking it really seriously. And then, it was exciting, like this rite of passage, like I'm 18 now, I can actually vote myself. And that was really exciting. It wasn't just, pretending anymore and practice and stealing all the stickers from the from the polling place. It was like, I actually get to do this myself. So that was exciting. So thanks for sharing all of your memories. The next question is, what's the history of your community in terms of voting rights? So like, what do you think about when you think about your community, however you want to define that? What's the history of your community in terms of voting rights?
I guess I'll start, if that's okay. So yeah. Currently I'm researching, as part of my current project, the queer history of the women's suffrage movement. And I'm looking at the various ways that women who fought for the vote defied conventional gender and sexual norms in their personal and public lives. So I'm looking at women who were gender nonconforming, women who had romantic relationships with other women, and thinking about how they imagined that securing the right to vote was just one step for them in securing other additional rights. So they didn't just see that as the end goal, right? They saw this as, if we get this right to vote, then we can get equal access to jobs and to education. And that will give us the financial independence that we need to be able to live on our own, to be able to live our lives as we please, and to really just love and live and be who they wanted to be. And so I think that is really fascinating to think about, that it's much more than just the right to vote itself.
Thanks, Wendy. Jack or Rosanna, do you want to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, kind of. That's the one I struggle with the most, because then it feels like a whole overwhelming flash of our entire community's multi-branched history.
Sure.
And so I think like, okay, when we learned suffrage and we learned, in those limited spaces where we talk about women's suffrage, we have certain names that come into the mix, right? Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and you learn a timeline. And then there's the the real suffrage timeline, if I'm thinking about myself as a Chicana, which is how I identify, and I'm thinking about how just even looking at myself, my positionality and my identity, that there's so many pieces of the story that aren't according to other folks' standards, you know, and I know this from experience because I've tried to say, here's a glimpse into our timeline, and I'll have people kind of low key try to fight me on that and be like, well, that's not suffrage, and I'm like, but it is. It's essential to our ability to continue to access our right to vote. And so, you know, if I start thinking about just the pockets of other women who are a part of that story, sure, that still feels incomplete though to me, because I have to think about like the several court cases that are in the queue that, you know, are still in some ways being challenged by the way our votes are being suppressed today. And so whenever anybody asks me that, I feel like a deer in the headlights. I'm like, oh, it's like all the things, right? That I kind of struggle to just grab one solid one and be like, let me take you on this journey of the timeline. And I had this conversation with other women in community and Chicanas in particular, and we were talking about how our suffrage story feels so personal in a very politicized way and very reflective of this broader history, that these conversations never, you know, they never have enough time for us to talk about it in a very basic sense. And so when we try to layer that complexity onto there, it's no wonder we're overwhelmed, because there is an overwhelming history that runs parallel to an overwhelming history of trying to suppress our vote and our rights and just our dignity as human beings who have, you know, value and a worth and are even counted as people, right? And we know that in this particular moment for sure. And so when I think about that, you know, my thinking immediately goes to what's closer to me and my own family's history. And that just feels a lot different than sometimes how I'm even teaching it in this tricky space when I have to teach from a mainstream feminist perspective in order to then unpack those other layers. And so that's all I got for you right now, because seriously, my brain is like, it's already, where do I start? Where do I finish? Where do I grab a branch to feel like, you know, sometimes it's overwhelming in the sense that if we're not grounding ourselves in all of these wins we've had throughout the years and how much we have to keep circling back to the same fight, it becomes this overwhelming sense of like, I have to not be drowning in this current reality. And so who can we lean on, you know, and who we lean on in a lot of ways has to do with our own personal story of where we gather our strength so that we continue to be in this fight. And I know there are so many problematic phrasings about even just women's suffrage. You know, we say, when did women earn the right to vote? And that just feels weird to say it that way because we didn't earn it. It's like trying to prove that we had to, you know, earn it. And that's different from how other folks get to talk about their right to vote being automatically granted to them from the beginning. And so I feel like that one always just brings up all the layers of injustice for me. And I'm like, you know, I can even start to feel like in my throat, there's a knot forming of like how overwhelming it is to try to explain to folks. Yeah, there's a history with a linear timeline. And yet, as a community and the issues, we constantly have to circle back and revisit. And it kind of feels like this constant hurricane of sorts. And it has, you know, in that entire story, there are names that come up. There are certainly highlights that we learn as a broader history. But again, what anchors a lot of us is that very personal connection to kind of like how this conversation started, right? A lot of us went to the stories of our moms. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks. I mean, I think you're raising, for me, what stands out about what you're saying is at such a significant point, which is that so much of this kind of legacy or history or context of who gets to vote and how people vote is about legitimacy and about a struggle over, you know, which groups of people do we see as legitimate actors and which groups of folks aren't. You know, from the very beginning, conceptualization, I'm thinking just in my mind, just from the conceptualization of our country, like who gets to be seen as like a legitimate full human being and who doesn't. And I think that that's for me like a fundamental issue that ties the past to the present, and also can connect, you know, all different communities, marginalized communities, to each other. Jack, did you want to weigh in, or we can move on to the...
No, I mean, I don't have too much more to say. I agree. I was thinking the same things along the lines of what Rosanna and what you just mentioned in terms of, yeah, I can think of many of my different communities that I belong to, but I think like was already said, it comes down to who is seen as valued in this society and who's seen as a full human being. And even when you, because we always, especially in the Latino community, there's, and it's not only the Latino community, but there's this assumption that only Latinos are undocumented, or Latinos are always migrants, and that's not true. Like, right, but there's this, in thinking about being undocumented and the fight, which I'm not, right, but the fight for citizenship, right? And it's like, once you even become a citizenship, which we've learned from our, from the Black community, right? That doesn't really grant you full personhood, right?
Such a great point.
So then what does that mean, right? In terms of having citizenship and being able to vote, or like, yes, being able to vote, right? But then I know we're going to talk a little bit more about like maybe voter suppression and stuff, but what does that mean in terms of even being able to access? So I even think about people who are incarcerated, right? Not being able, and our citizens not being able to access the vote, which I think that's changed. I haven't been keeping up, but I did see some headlines. I don't know if it was in California or somewhere, that folks who are incarcerated will be able to vote in this election, but also who really knows how that's going to play out? Because again, it's about who's valued, who's seen as full people, because there's also, I think, of this concept of social death, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
like in thinking about the experiences of marginalized people, and especially Black people in the US, but this notion of, yes, holding citizenship, but socially, like your social death of not really counting as a person and obstructing the spaces in which you can exert power, right? I.e. like voting. And I just saw this, you know, I'm on Instagram a lot. So I just saw Kerry Washington post this, you know, which many people have said before, but Kerry Washington posted this like thing on Instagram that was like, I know a lot of people think that like your vote doesn't really matter, but if it didn't matter, then they wouldn't be trying to keep you from voting, right? So I was like, that's really, I mean, that's one way to think about it too, right? Like if it didn't really matter, I mean, in this moment, democracy seems like a crock of shit that is not working and is not going to be working, or something needs to change. But on the other side, right, if these things didn't matter, then why would it not be easier to access? So those are just kind of my rambling thoughts.
Thanks.
And there's that reality too, right? Because we're celebrating, we say, the 100 years of women's right to vote. And it's like, well, depending on where we start the timeline, because the timeline is inherently attached to the disenfranchisement to begin with. Mm-hmm. And so the trouble with a lot of us is that we are so intersectional in a lot of ways. And on top of that, we don't fight our fights in, you know, silos. And so there is some cross, you know, storytelling, if you will. And so I know in my work, you know, as centered as I am in my Chicana identity, I pull a lot from, you know, the Filipina experience. I pull a lot from the Black African American experience. I have a lot of Native voices that really just kind of help me stand firm in where I am right now. And a lot of those are going to inherently be tied to our own timelines and stories. And so then, you know, it's not just one tree with a branch, but it's like a whole forest of story that's been kind of bulldozed to some extent. And it's still thriving in a lot of ways, for sure. But that story, then it's always a battle to like, well, if we're starting the story with "and then," the story's already skewed. And we are inherently starting the story off with "and then," right? Otherwise, there would be an entire history that precedes the centennial and that initial disenfranchisement in our current state of supposed democracy.
Thanks so much for those comments. I think this might be a good segue into the next question, which is, how is voter disenfranchisement, or how do you see voter disenfranchisement of the past related to voter suppression today?
I think that when you're looking at the history of the expansion of voting rights, that you're also looking at the history of the expansion of voter suppression. And so you have to look at those two side by side. So as everybody is mentioning, you know, we're talking about the centennial, the ratification of the 19th Amendment, but that does not guarantee the right to vote to anyone. It just says that you cannot be denied the right to vote on the basis of sex, which of course means that you can be denied the right to vote on various other categories, including race, class, etc. So the 19th Amendment is problematic in the history of it, in part because we're looking at, you know, Black women, Indigenous women, women of color facing all sorts of voter suppression, and then efforts to fight those, especially in the years following the ratification. So I think it's just important to keep in mind that securing access to the ballot box is an ongoing battle, and especially when we're looking at all the various means that are being used right now to suppress our vote, that this is not a guarantee. It was never a right that was earned or given or anything. It was something that people have fought for and are continuously fighting for.
Thanks, Wendy. Jack, getting back to what you were saying about the, I think it was Jack, you were saying about incarcerated folks, you know, and to me, this is like the perfect example of it's not what they say it's about, because like in Florida, you know, voters agreed to let people who were incarcerated, you know, be able to vote after they're out. And then they said, oh, well, you can't if you have fines, right? So then Bloomberg stepped in and said, I'm going to pay all these fines. And the state said, no, you can't do that. So, you know, it's not about what they say it's about. It's, in that particular instance, it's about making sure that this group of people don't vote, basically, that they don't have a voice, that they don't have the, you know, full rights of citizenship, that they're not seen as legitimate, that they're not seen as valuable to the community and what have you. And I think that, like, I really like what you said, Wendy, about the history of, you know, voting rights is also the history of voter suppression, because from, you know, this country in so many ways was really founded on the disenfranchisement of Indigenous peoples, the enslavement of, you know, Africans, slave labor, etc., and the consolidation of power and white supremacy together. So it's like this constant tension that is, I feel like, really, you know, built in to the foundations of even how we conceptualize ourselves as a country.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? It's like, I'm thinking of, as you're talking, I'm thinking not only of this, you know, this conversation about like women's suffrage, but also thinking about young people too in this moment, and how, when I think about, because I don't know, this conversation makes me think about a lot of kind of what's the word, like disillusionment, right? Because one thing is voter suppression and wanting to vote, but not having access to it. And then like just the disillusionment with voting in general and not working, especially for folks who come from marginalized backgrounds, who have consistently been disenfranchised in many ways. right? Which is a little bit more like off topic or kind of leading us down a different direction, but that's just what came up for me in thinking about that, right? In terms of like who, again, it just comes back to the same conversation about who matters, whose lives matter, right? Even thinking about, I know when we were prepping for this, right, I brought up like Black Lives Matter and what's been happening this year, and how this really has been, this movement is really, I mean, has been happening, right? But how people are being radicalized with all of the things that have happened this year, and what does that mean in terms of people fighting to be able to cast their votes, right? Especially when you have a pandemic on top of, you know, the racial pandemic of this country. So those are just my disjointed thoughts, but I don't know if anybody else wants to.
Rosanna, did you want to chime
Yeah,
in?
as Jack was talking, I was thinking about how, yeah, like for sure there's who can vote, right? Like who is allowed to vote, and who has to continue to fight to even access that as a right, and who has to keep revisiting that same fight to hold on to that right. And then you've got the fact that they don't want us to vote once we've got that right, and there is a lot that goes into that piece. I mean, we were driving around town, and I say town because I'm out in Gilroy right now, and there was a parade of cars with flags and certain, you know, political signage. And in the hostile environment that has been created for certain pockets of our population, that's almost, you know, you can say it's just folks supporting a candidate, but it almost feels like a warning. You're out around town and it feels hostile. And we're not even to the actual voting day yet. And we've seen more and more of those come up. And so that is an issue. And then once we get there, there's a whole range of like nationwide, we know that we're going to face certain difficulties once we show up to the polls with our, you know, official, yes, I can vote. Kind of feel like you got to take proof these days in hand. That's its own mitote. And then there's the fact that, you know, we're starting to question whether our votes will count, even if you show up and successfully cast your ballot. And, you know, I've got some fairly conservative friends that are like, you're super paranoid. And I'm like, I'm not paranoid. History has spoken, and there are receipts. And so the issue for us then becomes, well, how do we make sure, again, thinking about that younger generation, but all of us at this point really, that we're engaged enough to show up and almost like do it anyway, right? And to make sure that we're prepared to have receipts at the ready so that we know how to even check to see if it counted and was counted. So like, I think there are a lot of folks working in the here and now, a lot of nonprofits in particular, a lot of orgs, and I'm seeing way more information this time about like, here are some things that, you know, have been acknowledged as a shaky terrain right now, and here's some ways we can counteract that, because all is not lost. And that's an important message, because if I, who have been sparkly and excited to vote since I was 8 years old and it didn't count, you know, and feeling some kind of way about it, and I talk to students who are younger, you know, starting off, this might be their first official election where they get to cast a ballot at this level, are feeling like, well, why am I going to even vote? And I'm like, oh, you know, if I don't have a solid answer for you, I better summon something. Because even if I feel some kind of way about where we are now, it feels more daunting to not even try. And so how do we hold on to as much as we can about what activates our own vote every time, to really make sure that we're bringing as many people alongside us as necessary. And, you know, even if that means bringing folks into the mix like they did with us in the 80s, where it might not count, but there's something that counts about you being here, and being really firm in that message, and making sure that, you know, I have 3 kids. They're not old enough to vote. They won't be for a few elections from now. And hopefully by the time they're old enough, we're still here having elections. So, you know, making sure that they understand, like, it's not all stickers and, you know, we're past the point of hanging chads, but that there is an importance to it. And I think a lot of times we use these shamey narratives to be like, it's your civic duty to vote. You should want to vote. Voting is going to change everything. And I think we fail people when we do that, because it's very dismissive of the other parts of what enabled suffrage generally. And it's dismissive of the various parts that make us feel compelled enough to show up anyway for this thing we feel some kind of way about. And so I think it kind of behooves us in this moment to step beyond, you know, the reflex narrative of like, you should go out to vote. It's like, you know what, let's go out to vote. Let's support each other in that way, regardless of how we feel about it, and understand that we're doing A through Z range of activity and action that is also going to make this count in a different way. And I think if we can see the bigger picture that way, then what we're really saying is, to other people, I see you. Whether you have a right to vote or not, I see you, and your political participation matters. And so I think that's a part of our suffrage story that often gets overlooked.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that, because that's something that my co-host on Untitled Angelica and I have been talking about a lot, right? Like, because we're talking about, it's important to vote, but it's not go vote, period. It's go vote and, right? Like, it's not, and I think that's where people become so disillusioned in the suffrage story of like, oh, you have the opportunity or the privilege to vote, so use it. But then it's like, period, right? And sit back and wait for things to change on their own, or wait for these politicians to serve their communities, right? Which is not actual, it's why they're there, but that's not what actually happens, right? So to think about what it means to not only have that, so the way we've been talking about it, right, on our podcast is, if you're able to and you have the privilege, use it, not in a shaming type of way, like use it, and also do other things, right?
Yeah.
Use whatever skill set that you have to, you know, to contribute to the changing political landscape that we're currently living in, right? Because so many people in this moment are filled with hopelessness and despair, and like you said, Rosanna, like people are out here like paranoid or being labeled as paranoid, but I don't think it's for the wrong reasons, right? It's because, like, if you know history, or I studied Latin American history, right? I know, like, I know what a coup is. I know, like, these different, like, political movidas or movements that happen. And so, like, it's, and, you know, a lot of people, I think most recently, right, like with RBG passing away last week, and all the things that have happened, like, you know, a lot of people, again, like, what else is 2020 gonna bring? Like, and again, it's not just about 2020. It's we're gonna experience the same things because we're in this system that is no longer functioning. So how can we use our political and civic duty, but also our, in terms of voting, but how can we, again, use this moment to radicalize us in terms of voting and doing other things that bring visibility to whatever community you're a part of. So yeah, it's more than just casting a vote, but it's the kind of the what happens before and after and in addition to that.
And there's also, I mean, there's all different ways that people can be engaged, right? Like, maybe protesting isn't your thing. That's okay. Like, I had a friend who, she just makes the signs and drops them off, you know, because she, like, being out there isn't her thing, but she wants to contribute. So she makes signs for protesters and then, like, goes and drops them off. Like, some people can get involved in a political campaign. Some people, you know, like, there's for every individual, there's a unique way that they can contribute. And I just really appreciate, you raising these points, because I think that's absolutely correct. It's not vote the end. It's like, this is one way to be involved in the political process. And I think that, I don't know if you heard Barack Obama's speech during the Democratic National Convention, but one of the things that he was saying, and he just kind of touched on it, but then he also talked about it more at length in Michelle Obama's podcast, where he was saying, like, the only time that we really think about government is when it's not working for us, you know? But the thing is that government can and should work for people. And what we have going on right now is this very small group of people who are incredibly vocal, hoarding power, and they don't want to give it up, but they don't represent the majority of folks and their experiences. And I think that part of the disillusionment is like this idea that, like, well, government doesn't work. And it's like, yeah, a lot of times government doesn't work, but that doesn't mean it can't work. You know, it's like the government needs to work because that's part of this public commons. That's part of the public, you know, like, good. And I think that's something that we can remind ourselves of. It's like, I'm going to try to make it work because I'm here. I have to live here. You know, like, I can't go run away somewhere, even though sometimes I want to, you know, or just like hide in my bed all day. But it's like, I have to live here. So I want to make it the place that I want it to be, in whatever way that I can. And for my friends and my family and my community and people who are experiencing things similar to me. So yeah, the last question was, why is this election so significant, and why should SJS students vote if they can? So I think we've kind of touched on that. I don't know, Wendy, did you want to weigh in on anything?
Yeah, I always go back to the history of it. And one of the things that strikes me, especially in my research right now, is that, you know, especially focusing on queer suffragists and Black women, people of color, Indigenous people, they were marginalized in the suffrage movement in the worst possible ways. And yet they kept fighting. They kept fighting. They kept believing in the vote. And when I think about voter suppression, I think about all the legal barriers that can be put in place, you know, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, literacy tests. We think about moving voting station. We think about all the different ways that you can be denied the right to vote. But another form of voter suppression is just kind of convincing you that your vote doesn't matter. And I think if I had one message to SJSU students, it would be, your vote counts and your voice matters and your vote is your voice. You know, all those stupid slogans that we hear all the time, but they're true. I mean, because they want you to believe that your vote doesn't count, that your voice doesn't matter. And so I just want you to keep that in mind, that just resisting that alone is a resistance against voter suppression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also think, like, we need more young people to run for office. And we need more, you know, like, I was just listening to, I don't even remember where I was listening to it, but it was basically, this person was saying, like, you know, when they take polls, whatever, they're taking polls of likely voters. And likely voters are ages, you know, 55, 60 up, right? Because there's an assumption that young people aren't going to vote. But a lot of, like, AOC, she won her seat because so many young people turned out, you know, for her. And she was going door to door and, like, working so hard to get young people mobilized to vote. So it's like, if we wouldn't say just 18 to 35-year-olds in this they could decide the election. If you know, like, majority of 18 to 35-year-olds who are eligible to vote do, the election would be decided, you know? So it's like, I think that's really important. I want to see more people of color in office. at all levels. I want to see younger people in office at all levels. Like, it doesn't make sense that senators and representatives are like in their 70s and 80s. That doesn't make sense. That's not representative of the US population. You know, we need more 30 somethings and 40 somethings and 50 somethings even in all levels of politics, city council, school boards, state houses state houses and all different places. So it's like there's a lot of, it's not just about, I feel like we think about the election, we're just thinking about the presidential election most of the time in like the mainstream media, but there's a lot of levels of influence that are significant just on our day-to-day. You don't think the city council where you live is important. It is. Or the school board, or all of these other local elections are really important too.
That
Any
school
other
board,
thoughts?
it really is critical, that school board space. So I have seen locally an influx of folks, representation is broadening in that end, and it needs to reflect what families attend these schools for various reasons. And that's its own podcast in its entire 2-hour segment, right? But, I'm thinking about that comes up as an ongoing, know what's happening locally and be as committed to that process and those elections, because a lot of times we're so focused on the presidential piece that we show up and and we're all guilty of this at some point or another, but it's like, you can't be perfect all the time. So show up better next time. And so right now there's still time to show up, fully. And there's a range of things that are going to be decided by all of us. And the other thing is that a lot of times when things go a certain way in these bigger elections, we tend to blame certain pockets of people. And I'm like, what's the best way to not be blamed for certain outcomes is show up and be like, here's my darn receipts. Here is how I voted. I mean, you're not obligated to do that, but it's like, a lot of times I find power in being like, that was not me. Here's the 20 things that were me. But that one particular thing, let's be real about how those numbers panned out. And we can't be a part of that conversation or even that rebuttal if necessary if we don't show up, right? So we do have to show up relentlessly across the board. And a part of being able to show up relentlessly, like this barking dog in the background, I don't know if you can all hear it, but I can, is showing up even in that space where it might feel like it doesn't matter in this moment, but in the bigger scheme of things, how does your showing up have a ripple effect, beyond you? And so I think back to when I was 8, that had a ripple effect, beyond that particular moment. And so if we think in that bigger context, it's always going to matter.
Yeah, and I'm y'all are making me think too, right? Like, again, like this was already mentioned, but it's not just like the presidential election. Like, yes, that is key and imperative, but like y'all are saying, it's local too. And yes, city council, school board, but also like judges, right? Like you vote on judges and they have the power to incarcerate people and put people in cages, right? So, I mean, it's like there is power in that, even if you feel like there isn't power maybe at whatever level, but the local level is so important. And right now, I didn't understand that or believe that or really wasn't keen to that when I was younger, right? But now my partner is a public defender, right? And so every day she has to fight to get her clients out of, she's fighting for them to not be in jail for like really stupid stuff. Like a lot of people are committing poverty crimes, right? And maybe, have gone into people's homes just to steal food. That's the reality when you have crazy gentrification happening in places like Oakland or in the Bay Area, right, in general. So like the people that you're voting at the local level in terms of who the DA is, who the judge is, right, like that really shapes your community and how people are also valued and seen, right, in terms of how they're treated, in terms of the quote unquote justice system. It's not really a justice system in the way that it's functioning, but in this current moment. But I think that there is a lot of power in that. And I agree too with what Tanya was saying, right? Like even me, I was watching the DNC, and I'll admit I also watched parts of the RNC just to see what these folks were talking about. But to watch the DNC and to see all these old ass people, you know, like not even 50, but like people who are like, you know, like we shouldn't be holding on even to RBG, right? Like who was like in her late 80s, like that's our only savior. Like no, like, you know, younger people are really brilliant and creative and passionate about, you know, the environment and things. I think that there needs to be a shift that I think young people can bring to us, whether it's through going into local politics or state politics or into politics in general, or, you know, it's just like there is a lot of career politicians that have lost touch, you know, with what it really means to be a regular, ordinary person in our society in this moment, right? So I would just say, yes, this election really matters. It really does, but you being engaged beyond this moment also matters.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I'm not saying like old people shouldn't be in office. You know, like I don't mean to take an ageist tone.
I'm not saying that either. I'm just saying we need fresh.
We need fresh, and we need it to accurately reflect, right? Yeah. So it shouldn't be that like, you know, 50+% of senators are 70, 80 years old when the American people don't reflect that, right? It's not like 50% of all Americans are 70 or 80 years old. Like we need representation that reflects who we are.
And I think that that's fine that those people are there, but why not bring up younger people? That's what I would love to see, right? Like bringing up younger people. I think that's why Obama was really successful too with the younger crowd, right? He really, since he was in Chicago and working there, like he would incorporate young people into his movement, into his organizing, and same with AOC, right? Like there's a gap between young people and their potential in terms of going or choosing that kind of political pathway, and who's in power and bringing in younger, fresher people, right? So it's just, I'm thinking about the gap, not saying older people, they have a knowledge that they could share and mentor and also radicalize younger people in that way.
Agreed. Anybody have any, we kind of covered, I think, all the questions we had set out. So I'm just wondering if any of you have some like closing thoughts or, you know, just like final words, last words that you want to share.
I feel like my grandma will haunt me if I don't share this one because it's been on my mind. But when, you know, there's a lot going on in social media, and, you know, we see a lot of, this is what, you know, the notorious RBG did for us. And I'm like, that's not untrue. And still, when I see, tell them Ruth sent you, I'm like, Ruth's been sending me, and Ruth was my grandmother. And Ruth has been sending me ruthlessly for decades. And that doesn't take away from the accomplishments in this particular area of how we continue to access our rights. But at the same time, being fuller in that story and in that narrative. And again, it goes toward, I don't have this, I have a hesitancy to elevate people to hero worship because I know we're all flawed. And that doesn't minimize the accomplishments or the relevance or the importance of a legacy somebody with a big name leaves behind. And still, in a lot of ways, I know for me, that's a piece of the story. And the bigger impetus for me showing up ruthlessly is because of my own grandmother's legacy and what their lives meant to me and the struggles I got to experience firsthand in their kitchen sometimes. And so I always like to remind people, you know, my grandmother's names are Ruth and Mercedes, and that carries a legacy for me. That's a part of my suffrage, and it's going to continue to be what compels me to show up to vote, even when I'm feeling some kind of way. And that doesn't mean that I'm trampling the legacy of something that we all can collectively share. It means it all has to fit, and we all have to value how it all fits for all of us. And so in that sense, I did want to make sure to do that, because I'm telling you, she will haunt me if I don't.
Thank you. Jack or Wendy, do you want to have any final thoughts?
I thought that was the best final thought.
Yeah.
That was a good message.
Thank you. My last thought that I want to share is just to remind folks that one of the best ways that we can tear down the racist, capitalist, heteropatriarchy is to stop buying into the narrative that we don't have power, you know? And there's a lot, we can have power in a lot of different ways, and there's no one way to have power and to exercise power. But, you know, it's like someone else's message that's been put in our brains that we don't have power. And I feel like when we believe in ourselves and we believe in our capabilities and that we have a contribution that only we can make, we are given the biggest middle finger to all those people that say we don't matter. And I just want to encourage all the folks who are listening to really appreciate what they have to contribute at this particular moment. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. That was great final words. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you for joining us for our discussion on voting. It's really important that we all participate in the political process, whether that be through voting, if you can, and or advocacy. Please connect with us on social media, so you can find us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at SJSU GenEC. That's SJSU GenEC. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us next time.